Nós acreditamos que temos força e vontade para mudar as coisas. Nem sempre sabemos por onde começar. Em casa, na família, na comunidade, às vezes só precisamos de um impulso. Para buscar mudanças, é preciso se movimentar. E o direito funciona como essa ferramenta social. Encontrar as parcerias certas e as causas pelas quais lutar é o primeiro passo. Com a FMP, você vive essa experiência transformadora de ajudar a melhorar o mundo. FMP. Direito por excelência. Direito para a vida.
A minha causa, o que me liga ao direito, é quando eu penso num desenvolvimento sustentável. A forma como ele impacta a minha vida e a minha profissão. É quando eu penso numa infraestrutura resiliente, quando eu penso numa industrialização consciente, inclusiva, sustentável, quando eu penso em fomentar a inovação. Eu venho de um contexto muito inspirador, onde meu pai era caminhoneiro e criou a transportadora dele, da nossa família. A minha mãe é professora, pedagoga, pesquisadora, então eu tinha dentro de casa dois exemplos, um gerador de empregos e uma geradora de conhecimento. Sabia que qualquer coisa que eu fosse escolher seria de grande impacto. E quando eu conheci o direito, tive contato com o direito e a FMP, eu não tive nenhum segundo de dúvida de que eu cursaria.
Meu nome é Brenda IP, eu sou estudante da FMP do 10º semestre, eu tenho 22 anos e a minha causa é a redução das desigualdades. Eu tenho percebido que eu me vinculo muito às pessoas e um sonho que eu sempre tive, desde pequena, era que todas as pessoas pudessem ter aquilo que eu tive, aquilo que era necessário para eu viver bem. E isso passa pela redução das desigualdades. E o direito, ele tem métodos para conseguir enfrentar a situação que a gente vive. E eu encontrei no direito uma dessas formas para eu verificar como é que eu poderia ajudar de fato as pessoas.
Meu nome é Juliano Madalena, professor da faculdade do Ministério Público, mas principalmente ex-aluno. Eu gostaria de responder uma pergunta que muitos me fazem. Por que você escolheu ensinar? Foi a FMP que provocou esse sentimento e a busca por uma posição como professor em uma instituição. Ser professor e buscar uma educação de qualidade é uma arte. E nós observamos justamente no olhar dos nossos alunos a capacidade transformadora que a educação de qualidade tem. A formação do caráter, da intelectualidade e basicamente, principalmente, daquilo que nos faz mudar o mundo são os predicados que nós temos e oferecemos na FMP. Entrei aluno, saí advogado e volto professor.
Juliano.
Perfeito, professor. Perfeito.
Tá ótimo, tá ótimo.
Muito bem. O senhor quer fazer a abertura, então, professor? Depois eu passo para a professora Caitlin.
Eu faço em poucas palavras aí, se
tá.
Tu acha que dá.
Pode ser. Laura, podemos começar? Só a imagem do professor Tuns não está na tela, né? Aí assim que tiver, para o professor fazer a abertura. Aí, perfeito, professor.
Tá bem. Podemos dar o start?
Pode começar, fica à vontade.
Então, boa noite a todos. Eu saúdo inicialmente os professores Juliano Madalena e a professora Josi, queridos professores e amigos da faculdade, por essa iniciativa que é de grande valor para a FMP neste momento histórico que nós estamos vivendo. Então, nada podia ser melhor do que uma conferência deste nível com esta pessoa. Então, agora eu vou também saudar os estudantes que estão à distância, né, nos assistindo, os que estão presentes aí fisicamente, e eu espero que vocês aproveitem ao máximo. E depois essa conferência está gravada, né? Vocês podem assistir, inclusive a gente pode debater muito ela. E nós vamos entrar, então, diretamente para ouvir a professora. Eu vou fazer só uma saudação a ela e depois eu vou falar do currículo. Então, hi, Professor Carlson. How are you?
Boa tarde. It's good to be with you.
I'm happy to welcome you, Professor Carlson. And sorry for not speaking English. I'm the director of the law school, FMP. And now I will present your resume to our guests, the academic biography in Portuguese. A Caitlin, colega, gente amiga, a Caitlin Ring Carlson é PhD, professora associada do Departamento de Comunicação da Universidade de Seattle, tá? E ela vem para a academia com a formação profissional em relações públicas e tem PhD em estudos de mídia da Universidade do Colorado. Seus principais interesses de pesquisa são em direito e política de mídia, no que se refere às novas mídias, liberdade de expressão e justiça social. O seu trabalho atual se concentra no discurso de ódio. Ela também está interessada na liberdade de expressão das mulheres, incluindo a liberdade de imprensa das mulheres e, preste atenção, a propriedade, o direito de propriedade da mídia pelas mulheres. A doutora Carlson tem publicações em importantes revistas acadêmicas, tais como Communication Law and Policy, Journal of Media Ethics First Amendment Studies e Journal of Media Law Ethics. Então, ela é uma pessoa que tem uma larga publicação. Seu primeiro livro, Hate Speech, foi publicado pelo MIT Press em 2021. A doutora Carlson, atualmente, ensina Direito da Comunicação, Sistemas de Mídia e Redação, de Comunicação Estratégica. Ela foi nomeada professora do ano pela turma de 2015 e foi selecionada como professora do ano pela Faculdade de Artes e Ciências em 2019. A doutora Carlson fundou e supervisiona o programa de mentoria de ex-alunos do Departamento de Comunicação e atua como conselheira do corpo docente para o capítulo da Universidade de Seattle, da Sociedade de Estudantes de Relações Públicas da América. Lá, ela também atua como vice-chefe da Divisão de Direito e Política da AEJMC, Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. And now, Professor Carlson, I invite you to start the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director Tums. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Professor Madalena for inviting me. Again, boa tarde. I also wish my Portuguese were up to standards, so I will be speaking in English. And at any time, if anyone has questions they want to put into the chat or wants to get clarification, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll speak for a little bit, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. I know there are a lot of interesting issues around this area and this topic right now, both here in the United States and in Brazil. So looking forward to speaking with you all about those. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just get this going. As Director Tums said, I'm joining you here from Seattle University here in Seattle, Washington. And I'm happy to be with you all today to talk about the issue of hate speech and thinking about kind of what the balance is between protecting free expression and regulating things like hate speech and mis and disinformation. So I'll be talking a little bit about kind of the phenomenon of hate speech, and then looking at kind of what are some of the justifications that governments use to regulate this kind of speech, and then on the flip side, what are some of the reasons why we might want to protect this expression to allow for things like the marketplace of ideas or democratic self-governance. I'll also touch on the different approaches of different countries, including Brazil, and then focus specifically on social media, because we know that is where quite a few of these questions surrounding hate speech arise. So without further ado, I'll dive right in. So unfortunately, no country or culture is immune to the effects of hate speech. This is a photo from Myanmar, where the Rohingya Muslims were targeted by members of the military with a campaign on Facebook alleging that they were CalRs or dogs. People said all kinds of vitriolic things about them, and that it forced the evacuation of about 700,000 folks from this country. In Japan, you can see this photo here. This is the Zaido Kukai, which is a hate group that is actively working against the Zanichi Koreans in the country. So ethnic Koreans who have been in Japan for sometimes generations. There are hate groups that actively strike out against them. And then here in the United States, unfortunately, we too are certainly not immune from groups like white supremacists. You may have seen we had yet another mass shooting in the past couple days up in Buffalo, where a racist gunman targeted African Americans at a local grocery store in Buffalo, New York. So we know that hate speech is related to offline violence. I want to talk a little bit about what hate speech is and what it isn't. So there are lots of different definitions for hate speech. And I think one of the things that can make regulating this form of expression so difficult is the subjective nature of the definition. So I define hate speech as any kind of expression that seeks to malign people based on their fixed identity characteristics. So essentially what this means is the things about their identity that they don't have control over, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their race, their ethnicity. Any of these things, these fixed identity characteristics, when targeted, can actually be the fuel for the fire that eventually becomes bias motivated violence or genocide. So I think hate speech, again, is any of this expression that targets fixed identity characteristics. What hate speech is not, though, is it's not just offensive language. So saying that you don't like someone because of their political beliefs or their views on a particular issue doesn't amount to hate speech. We want to distinguish hate speech from offensive language, and note that it really is about targeting people's identity characteristics, the things about themselves they don't have control over. In many countries, including the United States, we also distinguish between hate speech and hate crimes. So hate crimes are crimes that are motivated by a person's fixed identity characteristics. So for example, an assault on a particular person that's targeted at them because they are transgender or because they are African American. And in the United States, we have additional penalties for crimes of that nature, as do many other countries. Now, I think one of the things that's important to talk about as we start to think about what do we do about this form of expression and kind of the tension between protecting free expression and wanting to minimize the harm caused by hate speech is to essentially recognize that hate speech is structural. So throughout history, there are several examples of how hate speech has been used by people in power to maintain their preferred position in the social hierarchy. Essentially, people in power will use slurs or other demeaning terms to subordinate members of other groups. So, for example, in the United States, there are all kinds of slurs that were used against Native Americans as the colonists were coming in and working to subordinate this social group. Essentially, what this language does is it dehumanizes people, and it essentially makes violence against these groups more palatable. And we have examples of this essentially throughout history. So, for example, in the Holocaust, we know that Jewish people were referred to as rats or vermin. In Rwanda, we know that the Hutus referred to the Tutsis, the ethnic minority, as injinzi or cockroaches. In Myanmar, in the example I showed earlier, folks were called dogs. And this dehumanizing language, this hate speech, really, you can see this is a what they call the pyramid of hate. It's from the Anti-Defamation League. And they created this to show how hate speech and other forms of language actually are the foundation for what becomes discrimination and bias motivated violence. So throughout, again, history, we have so many examples of how it's not just words. So you may have heard kind of the old saying, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You know, I don't think that's necessarily true. In fact, I think that certain forms of expression are part and parcel of what leads to bias motivated violence and even genocide. And we're seeing that more and more as people become radicalized online, that the expression, the content they consume via social media is what fuels their action offline. I mentioned here in the United States, the recent shooting of 10 people in Buffalo. When they look at the gunman and kind of what he was consuming online, they found quite a bit of hate speech, and he had put together a manifesto that had all kinds of hateful rhetoric included in it. So again, I think it's really important to think about what do we do about this form of expression, knowing that it can lead to things like the Holocaust. This is an example of a cartoon. This kind of rhetoric around the time of the Holocaust was infused into everything from newspaper articles to children's books to nursery rhymes. What you see here actually says, do not grow weary, do not loosen the grip. The poisonous serpent may not slip away. Better that one strangles to death than our misery begin anew. And you can see that the features of the snake are drawn as if they are a Jewish person. And so, again, this is one of many cartoons by Philip Ripprecht, who was a cartoonist. He had images that would appear in propaganda newspapers like Der Stürmer. And this was part of how Germans convinced the population to enact mass murder, essentially, on an entire group of people. Again, in Rwanda, and you'll see throughout these different examples, one of the things that's interesting to note is how media plays a role in disseminating this information. So the example I showed earlier was a newspaper cartoon. Again, I said this information appeared on the radio, in films, in children's literature. It appeared everywhere. In Haiti, in the genocide in Haiti in the 1990s, the radio was used by the ethnic majority to convince people to enact violence against the ethnic minority, the Tutsis. They ended up engaging in mass killings that reduced the Tutsi population by 75%. And you can see here on RLTM, which is the major radio station in Rwanda, the government would go on and again espouse hate speech against the ethnic minority, which eventually led to violence against them. In Myanmar, this is probably, we see are certain examples like this cropping up all over the world. Now that social media has become one of the primary ways we communicate. And what's interesting about this compared to other forms of media, when I was talking earlier about newspapers or radio, really it was the government or certain types of media industry professionals that would have access or the ability to use these tools for these problematic campaigns or these hate-filled campaigns. When it comes to social media, we all have access. And so in this example, it was in fact the government that they essentially created several fake Facebook accounts that were made to look like pop stars in the country or other kind of well-known public figures. And they used that to publish hate speech against the Rohingya Muslims in that country. So you can see here, this says, may the terrorist dog Kalars fall fast and die horrible deaths. The text says, these non-human Kalar dogs, these Bengalis are killing and destroying our land, our water, and our ethnic people. We need to destroy this race. And so we can imagine, again, this has led to the exodus of 700,000 Rohingya Muslims from the country of Myanmar. Several people have been killed. There was a campaign of arson and rape leveled against this community. And it's no surprise given the fact that there were thousands upon thousands of hateful Facebook posts targeted at these groups. A study by Reuters and UC Berkeley found thousands of posts calling the Rohingya dogs, Muslims, maggots, rapists, and these pages had millions of followers. And so what we can see here is how media can be used to get buy-in for these ideas that certain races or certain religions are better, if you will, than others. Now, one of the questions that I often think about is, well, why do we do this, right? Why is it that we can't get to a place where we say, well, we're all human, right? Every human has rights. Every human deserves dignity. What is it about separating ourselves into these ethnic or racial groups that serves us? And one of the things that sociologists have found is that we oftentimes seek to reaffirm our in-group or social identity by targeting members outside of our group. So in other words, we create a positive association with ourselves as Brazilians, as Catholics, as Muslims, as women, whatever our identity groups are, we create affinity by comparing ourselves to other groups, right? And so, for example, oh, Catholics are superior because we honor Easter and believe in the resurrection of Jesus, or whatever those things are. It often helps us to separate ourselves from these other groups. Here's why Catholics are better than Protestants. And so we essentially degrade other groups in order to maintain our own positive social identity. And this can be incredibly problematic. Now, in the United States, it's no secret that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. So too is fake news and most other forms of expression. Unless speech falls into a category that is unprotected by the First Amendment, that's been carved out by the Supreme Court, and those include things like true threats, incitement, fighting words, or even harassment. Otherwise, unless it falls into one of those categories, hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. So those categories, for example, have very specific legal doctrine and common law associated with what counts or what doesn't. So I'll just give you an example. To be considered incitement to violence in the United States, expression has to be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and be likely to produce such action. So oftentimes a lot of the extreme speech that we see online, for example, can't be linked imminently to offline violence. And so it doesn't count as incitement. Also, unless someone is speaking to a group that is likely to act on their calls for violence or illegal action, it's not likely punishable by law. In addition to that, and I don't need to tell you all in terms of, I'm sure what you've seen in your own experience, people with power and privilege often do not or are not held accountable to the same standards as the rest of us. So here in the United States, our former President Trump was actually impeached or charged with impeachment for inciting the January 6th riot on the Capitol. He obviously never faced jail time or any real consequences, but people will look at that speech and say, well, he's telling people to go to the Capitol, but he's not inciting immediate violence, and so it doesn't violate this regulation. Same thing with true threats. To be a punishable threat in the United States, the expression has to threaten specific physical harm or death to another individual. So threats to groups, for example, all Muslims should, none of that stuff counts. In addition, we have a strict form of judicial review that's applied to any kind of content-based regulation. So strict scrutiny is the highest level of judicial review, and that's what any content-based regulation, like a law against hate speech, would need to pass. And so you can see the US approach differs substantially from what the UN advocates for, the EU, countries such as Japan, Brazil, South Africa, all kinds of places have regulations prohibiting hate speech, and the United States does not. So in terms of the question of why do we do this? Why do we do this so differently than so many other countries here in the United States? There are a couple of theoretical justifications that scholars and politicians will often cite as reason for protecting expression. And so one of the things that I hope that you can get out of today is really, I'll present you with the reasons why we choose to protect hate speech in the United States, and also discuss the reasons why many other countries choose not to protect hate speech. And I think those provide really good reasons for you developing your own understanding or your own perspective on how this expression should be treated. I talk about in my book quite a bit about how this is a very nuanced question. It's certainly not black and white. And so my goal with my work in general is to provide people with the information that they need in order to form their own opinion about how this kind of expression should be treated. So I'll just run through each of these. And again, if you've got questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. In the United States, the primary justifications for protecting all expression, including hate speech, first is the marketplace of ideas. So essentially what this theory says is that in order for truth to emerge, in order for us to know what is and isn't accurate, we need to let all ideas enter the public sphere and essentially battle it out, compete with one another. And through that process, truth will emerge to the top. I think in theory, this is good. I think today there are potential issues with how this process actually works. We know that given the sophistication of artificial intelligence and bots on social media, not all of the expression that we're exposed to is even created by humans. Another piece to consider is the fact that the volume of expression in the marketplace is so high that it's difficult for truth to emerge. It's difficult for people to determine what's accurate and what's not. And so again, as a theory, I think the marketplace of ideas is admirable. I think in practice today, it needs to be updated because we know that there are certain issues where the truth does not emerge to the top. At least in the United States, we have substantial climate deniers, so people who believe that climate change is not real. We had a substantial amount of dis and misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccine. So people believed, for example, that somehow the government was going to track your movement, that they put like a tracker in you when they gave you the COVID vaccine, things like that. So again, in theory, I think the marketplace idea of ideas is admirable. I think in practice, there are some issues. Okay. Now, the second reason that people will cite in terms of, well, why do we protect so much expression here in the United States is this idea of democratic self-governance. And this comes from a scholar called Alexander Michaeljohn, who was writing right after World War II, 1948. And he essentially argued that in order for a democracy to be able to govern itself, we need access to all available information, whether that's hate speech, whether it's misinformation, it doesn't matter the quality of the information. We need access to information in order to be able to govern ourselves. I think this is a relatively sound justification for protecting expression. The one issue that oftentimes critics will raise, however, is that when we have hate speech or harassment as protected expression, this can actually serve to silence certain individuals or groups. And so it prevents them from participating in that process of self-governance. So there's a scholar called Danielle Citron, and she wrote a book called Hate Crimes in Cyberspace. And in it, she essentially argues that when women and people of color are targeted, particularly online, with hate speech, they're not able to participate in civic debate or participate in the process of self-governance because that expression essentially silences them. They say, forget it, I'm out of here, I'm not going to participate. So that's at least one of the critiques against democratic self-governance as a justification. But again, the theory itself says that we need information to be able to govern ourselves. Now, the next theory in terms of why we protect expression has to do with autonomy and personal liberty. Essentially, this argument says that we do not need the government to tell us what to say or write or think for that matter. And so this work was initially developed by a scholar named Thomas Emerson, and he argued that in order to, this is coming out of a lot of the Enlightenment thinking of the late 19th century, and Emerson argued, and Baker, C. Edwin Baker built a bit on this work, but essentially argued that in order to achieve our full human potential, we need to be able to express ourselves fully. And so any kind of interventions into the speech marketplace on behalf of the government are going to be problematic. Now, the next couple of reasons associate just with hate speech. So sometimes when people are talking about why we should allow hate speech, why we should allow this kind of expression into our public discourse, they'll cite what they call the Bellwether Argument. And essentially what this argument says is that in order for us to know how truly either racist or misogynistic or homophobic a society is, we need that information out in the open rather than hidden underground. And so proponents of this idea suggest better to know what we're dealing with rather than to not have a clear picture of where people stand on these issues. The next argument is the safety valve argument. And essentially what that argues is that people should be allowed to use hate speech as a way of blowing off steam. So thinking about like a pot with a lid as the steam is boiling and the pot is lifting up, that's the safety valve idea, that we rather let out steam in the form of expression rather than allow that to build into violent acts. Now, unfortunately, there's no empirical evidence to show that this is true. And in fact, we can see through some of the historical examples I shared earlier, even through to today, that we know oftentimes it is a combination of economic issues along with vitriolic rhetoric that can lead to political and unrest and even violence. And so the idea that allowing people to use hate speech will somehow minimize violence, I think quite the opposite is actually true. Allowing hate speech will embolden people with similar views and encourage them to go out and commit acts of violence against those they're targeting. Finally, the last argument that folks will give in terms of, well, why do we protect so much expression in the United States, particularly hate speech? And this one I do think is worth exploring. Essentially, we're afraid that any kind of hate speech law or any form of laws against free expression will be used to silence political dissent. So we do not necessarily trust the government to regulate expression. We would rather allow kind of the market in the form of consequences, right? If I say something horrible on Twitter, I might get fired from my job, right? We'd rather have society or the market, the speech marketplace, kind of correct these issues than allowing the government to be able to make decisions about what forms of expression are and are not violations of any kind of law, in particular, some proposed hate speech law. So we can imagine a scenario where a particular political party points to what others are saying about it or about its leader and say, oh, that's hate speech, that the law itself is abused. And we actually do have in this country some evidence that that is what happens. So back in the late 1980s and 90s, college campuses enacted what they called hate speech codes. They tried to extend the fighting words doctrine and apply codes on college campuses that said, for example, you can't use racial or ethnic slurs against people. And what happened was at one school at the University of Michigan over the course of a year, there were 17 cases or complaints filed under this hate speech code. And what happened in reality was 16 of the 17 complaints were filed by white students against Black students. And so what we see sometimes with these regulations, we see the same thing, and I'll talk about this in a second, in South Africa, right? South Africa has some of the most stringent hate speech laws in the world, but they're used by people who have traditionally been colonizers or oppressors against the people they're meant to protect, against members of historically marginalized communities. So in South Africa, for example, white people will bring hate speech charges against Black folks. So in terms of, well, why should we protect expression? Honestly, in a lot of places, particularly in the United States, we simply don't trust the government to enact this fairly. And we're fearful that it will either be used against the people that we're meant to protect or will be used to silence political dissent. Okay, I'd next like to talk a little bit about hate speech regulation in other countries. In the book, I talk about Germany, Canada, South Africa, Japan, Brazil, and the United States. And these are all very, very different approaches to regulating hate speech. One of the things that I think is really interesting and is important for us to kind of keep in mind as we start to talk about what's happening with the fake news bill in Brazil right now, or what's happening here in the United States in terms of some of these state laws. Just because laws are written and enacted doesn't mean they're necessarily applied or applied fairly. And so I just want to note that as we begin to talk about, well, what do different countries do surrounding hate speech, some of these efforts are far more effective at actually eradicating hate speech than others. So a little bit of the history around hate speech regulation. After World War II, the UN was formed, and one of the first things they did was develop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first human right is dignity. And then they also developed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And essentially what the ICCPR said is that for member states of the United Nations, advocacy of national, racial, religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination is prohibited. So this is one of the key differences that we see between the United States and many other countries or bodies that condemn hate speech. Here in the US, incitement to violence is what is prohibited. In many other countries, it's incitement to hatred. It's getting people to hate another ethnic group or another religious group that is actually punishable. So that different kind of definition of incitement is something that shows up quite a bit in a comparison of these different laws. In addition to the ICCPR, the UN also eventually created ICERD, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And essentially what this did is condemned propaganda that promoted ideas of racial or ethnic superiority, and promoted instead freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. The European Union also has stringent regulations regarding hate speech. They require member states to sanction racism and xenophobia through criminal penalties. One of the other things I want to mention about the EU, and I think this will be something to watch going forward. So the EU actually has a couple of new pieces of legislation that are going to really impact the way technology companies, social media operate in Europe. And so the new Digital Services Act, which is set to go into effect in just, I think, about a year and a half, 2024, I think is when compliance will be required. Essentially, what this is going to do is allow governments to ask companies like Facebook or Twitter to take down content that is illegal, including hate speech. So it's requiring a lot more from social media companies, like giving users tools to better flag problematic content. It's requiring additional transparencies from these companies. And this is really a shift because up until now, the UN and the EU have taken a very, I don't want to say entirely hands-off approach, but they haven't required removal of illegal content on the part of social media companies. Instead, they've modeled the US approach, which essentially provides legal liability, a shield from legal liability for social media companies. So in the United States, Section 230 protects social media companies and other computer services from legal liability for what third-party users do on their site. So for example, if I go onto Facebook and say something defamatory about Director Tums, he can sue me, he can't sue Facebook. And that's traditionally been kind of the approach in the US since the mid-90s. That is what the UN had advocated for, but now through this new EU bill, we're seeing a shift. And that actually reflects and is a nice segue to what different countries like Germany and France are doing. So Germany, unsurprisingly, probably has the most strict hate speech laws in the world. Again, given their experience with the Holocaust, they know firsthand how rhetoric, how language can be used to motivate people to participate in genocide. And so they do have very strict criminal laws as well as civil laws against hate speech. One of the other things that Germany does in addition to criminal laws, so hate speech, if you engage in hate speech or incitement to hatred, which includes Holocaust denial, you can face up to 3 years in jail. They also have torts or civil claims for group defamation. So if someone makes a defamatory statement about a group of Muslims, for example, an individual member of that group can sue. But what's really interesting that Germany has done over the past 5 years or so is NetzDG. So Germany was the first country to essentially require social media to take down illegal hate speech and now fake news, or risk substantial fines. And when I say substantial fines, I mean like 50 to 60 million euros. And so it was interesting to watch how social media companies like Facebook responded. They hired a bunch of other human content moderators that spoke German to help implement compliance with this law. France actually has a similar law for hate speech. France also has a law that applies right around election times regarding hate speech removal and fake news removal from social media. And again, I think that's really interesting thinking about the fake news bill in Brazil right now that Facebook and Google have been working so hard to prevent from being enacted. I feel like you should be telling me this, but I do know that in Brazil, there is the law against racism, which essentially condemns practicing, inducing, or inciting discrimination or prejudice of race, color, ethnicity, religion, or national origin, which can be punishable by jail time or a fine. This law actually also makes it illegal to manufacture, commercialize, distribute, or transport symbols, emblems, ornaments, badges, advertisements that use the swastika or swastika let me back up, that use the swastika for purposes of spreading Nazism in Brazil. So because there were so many Nazis that fled to Brazil after World War II, your country has enacted specific laws to try to minimize the spread of these beliefs within the country. There's also a category of libel in Brazil, which I think is fascinating, called racial disparagement. In fact, I think the libel laws in your country are absolutely incredible. I was fascinated during my research for the book to learn about the different ways that people could pursue defamation suits. Now, one of the things that is worth noting is that within this racial disparagement category, it addresses race and ethnicity, but not necessarily gender or gender identity. Now, again, as we discussed with South Africa, there is that discrepancy between having civil and criminal penalties on the books versus how many convictions actually occur. Again, I don't want to speak out of turn and I want to be careful about what I say, but from an outsider's perspective looking in, one of the things that's challenging, and I know that we in the United States can relate to this because of our experience with former President Trump, but having a president who he himself uses hate speech to either condemn a particular group of people or members of the LGBTQ community, really, I think, makes it difficult for people to take seriously the existing rules regarding hate speech in a particular country. So Bolsonaro, as you may or may not know, has called congresswomen sluts, has referred to women journalists as uneducated idiots. He targets non-white people, particularly immigrants from places like Senegal, Haiti, Bolivia, one time referring to them as the scum of the world. So, and again, when we start to look at what's happening with the fake news bill, and I'm hoping that you can tell me what's really going on, because I think as somebody who's just reading news stories, whatever news stories are available in English, and these are primarily something I'm finding on places like the Poynter Institute, so a think tank that focuses on journalism and laws that impact journalism, they're covering this pretty closely. And in that coverage, they talk about how Bolsonaro maneuvered congressional allies to kind of stop the bill. It sounds like it's going through now, but I know that he's been vehemently against this. So too have Google and Facebook really nervous about what this bill will do. I know for citizens, having this bill passed prior to the elections in October is essential. We know that when information is manipulated, it impacts our ability to govern ourselves. And so I just commend the efforts of the people there to try to enact legislation that would address some of these issues. I don't want to belabor the point, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. I'm happy after I wrap up, if you want to hear more about the approach to dealing with hate speech in places like Japan or South Africa, I'm happy to do that. But I want to make sure we have time to discuss the justifications or the theoretical reasons why people advocate for restricting hate speech. The United States Constitution doesn't recognize human dignity, but many, many other constitutions, along with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognizes dignity. And we know that hate speech erodes human dignity, right? It makes people seem less human. Certain groups are less human than others. And so one of the primary justifications for why we should not allow hate speech, whether that's in person or online, is the impact that it has on human dignity, which in turn, I believe, creates a climate for discrimination. There's a legal scholar, her name's Catherine McKinnon, and she has argued for years that expression, particularly vitriolic expression or hateful expression, can be used to subordinate one group to another. And so when we have this language targeted at particular racial groups or members of the LGBTQ community or certain religions, right, it creates a climate for discrimination against those people, right? If I can convince you that African Americans are less human than whites, if I can convince you that Muslims are less human than Christians, then it's not a problem to deny a Muslim person a loan, or to say they can't live in your neighborhood, or to redline their neighborhoods or make it so they can't live in certain areas, or to not allow them into a particular school or select them for a particular job. So hate speech, in my opinion, really does create a climate for discrimination. The other thing that new research is showing is that it has very real psychological as well as physiological effects on those targeted. There's a great book called Words That Wound, where some of the original theorists who introduced the idea of critical race theory talk about hate speech, and they suggest that the biggest harm hate speech can cause is that it leads people who are targeted to believe the things that are being said about them. And so it's absolutely essential. We also are starting to see medical studies that demonstrate the stress that hate speech or racism in the public sphere can have, especially on young people. In the United States, our Journal of the American Medical Association, Journal of Pediatrics, released a study 3 years ago that found that public expressions of discrimination generated stress and behavioral health problems, particularly in young people who are part of a racial or ethnic minority. In fact, the entire Academy of American Pediatrics issued a report 3 years ago as well, based on 180 studies, and they warned of the acute health dangers of public expressions of racial discrimination. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, this type of expression can silence people and groups, and it makes them difficult for folks to participate in the process of self-governance. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is social media, and I think that'll lead us into what I hope will be an interesting conversation about the legislation in Brazil, as well as some of the efforts to regulate social media here in the United States. So I want to start a little bit just to make sure we're all on the same page regarding the process of content moderation. So in most countries, particularly countries that are part of the United Nations or the EU, the general approach has been one that is hands-off. The general approach has been that we see social media as private virtual spaces that are free to make whatever rules they want, which we then agree to. When I click I agree in the terms of service in order to be able to access Facebook or Snapchat or whatever the application is, I'm essentially agreeing to whatever rules or community standards the company has set. And so when we think about the process of regulating expression online, particularly by third-party platforms like social media or web hosting services, we tend to think about it as three different elements. So the one I mentioned earlier is the policies themselves. So social media organizations and other web services will decide what is and what isn't allowed on their platform. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, as at least in the United States, as speech permissive as the law would mandate, right? So in the United States, hate speech is allowed under the First Amendment. If social media companies want to restrict hate speech on their sites, they're welcome to, again, because they're private virtual spaces. So Organizations will craft policies that say, okay, nudity is not allowed, hate speech is not allowed, bullying is not allowed. They create whatever rules they want. And then the second kind of phase is using algorithms and artificial intelligence to enforce those rules. So automatic detection accounts for most content moderation. So if you post something that violates the company's community standards, whether that's a copyright violation, right? You're posting copyrighted material, you're posting something hateful, any of that kind of content can be removed and is often identified and removed through automatic detection. When human users see content that violates the community standards, they have a flagging system that allows them to indicate this content is problematic and needs to be reviewed. Sometimes that review will be done by human content moderators, but more often the review is done by an algorithm that assesses to what extent the content is a violation of the company's community standards. Again, these social media companies are not required to follow in the US, they're not required to follow First Amendment jurisprudence. In most countries, they're not required to follow the permissions around expression dictated by the government. Instead, they can go much further and they can decide, even arbitrarily, right? If Facebook decided tomorrow that they didn't want people to use the word blue, the color blue, no using the word blue on Facebook, they could do that, right? It's their community standards that they set that we agree to in order to access the platform. And in doing that, we kind of enter into a private contract with that company about what the rules are. And we always have the option, if we don't like the rules, in theory, to simply log off. Now, in reality, social media has become such an integrated part of our lives that it's impossible to suggest to someone to simply log off. I mentioned earlier the Digital Services Act in the EU. Again, this would allow governments to ask companies like Facebook and Twitter to take down a large amount or range of content, including illegal hate speech. It also would change the requirements regarding what companies need to provide in order for people to be able to flag content. It would also have implications in terms of transparency. So providing more transparency around how the algorithm is used. We know, for example, particularly given, I don't know if folks were following the Facebook whistleblower here in the US, but a woman who had worked at Facebook essentially released a bunch of private documents that indicated that, in fact, what scholars had suspected for years, which was the algorithm on Facebook and other news feeds, like even on YouTube in the video feed, it prioritizes extreme content, right? So the goal of social media companies above everything else is to make money, right? These are for-profit, publicly traded companies. Their goal is to make money. And so the way that they set up the algorithm is designed to keep me on the platform as long as possible, right? And what we found is that they'll do that by serving up either hateful or extreme content, but also mis and disinformation. So something as simple as, say I really do have questions about the COVID vaccine, and I go onto YouTube and I'm thinking about how is the COVID vaccine going to impact my 9-year-old daughter, right? I go in, I look up a video, it shows me a video. The next video it shows me is likely to be extreme and contain mis and disinformation, potentially even that scares me about the impacts of the COVID vaccine, so that I stay on the platform. I keep watching videos. I keep digging for more information. Same thing with hateful content, right? As I, let's say, look up something about the Buffalo shooting and the shooter's manifesto, it's going to continue to serve me content that feeds that viewpoint in order to keep me on the platform longer. And what's interesting about social media is we decide what we access, right? Unlike traditional forms of media where we're often given kind of a balance of different information, we decide what we go for on social media and selectively expose ourselves to particular information. So the Digital Services Act, I think, is going to really change the way social media organizations respond to problematic content, including hate speech and mis and disinformation. Now, again, I feel like many of you in this room are much more familiar with the fake news bill than I am. And so I just want to, again, share some insights in terms of, as an outsider looking in, what has been so surprising about the way that this bill and its opposition has unfolded is just the amount of political capital that's been used to try and defeat it. The amount of outspoken opposition from companies like Facebook and Google is astounding, right? Again, from other people looking outside in, it is a surprise to see how aggressively Google and Facebook are trying to defeat this bill. I read that Google on its homepage in Brazil featured a statement about a link that allowed you to get more information about how the fake news bill could force Google to fund fake news. You can see one of the full page ads that Google ran in a daily newspaper saying that the bill would lead to disinformation. It asked people to put pressure on their legislators to not pass the bill. Facebook ran full page ads as well, saying that the fake news bill should fight fake news. It shouldn't fight the diner in your neighborhood. So trying to pull small business owners in to oppose this bill. It's just incredible. And I think the amount of resources that these companies have to influence legislation is breathtaking, right? And it really is, I think, frustrating to see where if and when and where efforts are made to account for some of these incredibly problematic issues that have arisen given the lack of regulation around social media, including the volume of fake news. You know, here in this country, people were convinced that our election was a fraud, that it was fake, and people acted on that misinformation. We've created filter bubbles. We don't, in this country at least, have an agreed upon set of facts. We are getting different news from different places, and we all don't even agree on what's reality. And so there is a lot of damage that the mismanagement of this process of content moderation has done, and a change is needed. So again, I commend those people that are finding ways to either legislate or address this in other ways. For me, I think deplatforming works. There's all kinds of information that says that taking problematic individuals and accounts off of these platforms leads to less hate speech, less mis and disinformation. I think shadow banning, Reddit is probably the group that's done this the best, but basically what shadow banning does is it limits the extent to which certain accounts their information can be amplified. So if I know that you're a problematic account and I know that you're constantly spreading hate speech, you can still post, but it's not going to go to thousands of people. It's not going to be picked up by the algorithm. It's going to go to your 200 followers, and that's it. We might also think about how we treat anonymity on the internet, right? I think a lot of the ways that people behave, particularly when it comes to hateful speech and hate speech, they wouldn't say those things in person, or they wouldn't say those things if their name or identity were attached. I also think that we need more detailed policies about how we regulate artificial intelligence, and we need transparency within the company to understand how these algorithms work and what they're doing. We don't allow fake advertising. I don't know why we would allow this kind of technology to manipulate us into believing things that are simply inaccurate. And then again, I think laws like the Digital Services Act are a step in the right direction. More broadly, I think educating people about the harm of hate speech, fake news, all of these issues is absolutely essential. The more media literate we can ask people to understand, well, here's how social media works, or here's how traditional media works, and here's what they're trying to do. Their goal is to make money, and so they're manipulating us. The more we can see that, the better consumers of this information we can be. In the United States, I strongly advocate for the use of civil penalties to address this. So using existing torts like intentional infliction of emotional distress, for example, to sue people who are causing harm to groups and individuals because of the expression they use. And then finally, I think, part of what is going to be required to combat an issue like hate speech, in my opinion, is going to be each and every individual speaking up and speaking out against these things when they encounter them. And I know that that's not easy to do. I think the solution for this problem, again, is nuanced, it's complicated, but it does require systemic change as well as individual change. And, that's potentially going to take some time, but I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And again, I commend those folks in Brazil who are working to at least propose legislation to try and move the needle on this issue. So that's my remarks. I know I'm at about 50 minutes, so I went a little bit over, but I would be happy to answer any questions or further the discussion based on people's interest, or, again, if you all have information that you can share in terms of the fake news bill and what's happening, I'm anxious to learn.
Much, Professor Carlson. I will ask the students if they have questions, because I have some questions. Pessoal, alguém tem perguntas? Yeah. We have a question here from Alicia.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. It's really nice to meet you. Actually, a pleasure. My question is about the metaverse. What do you think that you're going to do about it? So, there are many. Let's say that someone commits a crime in there. So, do you think it's going to be a different legislation about it? What are you talking about in there? Because, sorry, it's much like a topic that you discuss in the United States. That's so, how can I say, new about it. Here in Brazil, we don't discuss it. So, what's your vision about what's going to happen? It's going
at least
to be the same things that they apply in the real life, let's say, or in the metaverse, it's going to be something different. What do you think that's going to happen?
That's a really great question. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but what I can tell you is, based on what we've seen so far, I think the response is going to be very reactionary. We didn't talk about this, but I think lawmakers don't fully understand the technology. And so oftentimes it feels like action doesn't occur until there's a problem. So for example, I don't know if you were following in the metaverse, there was a problem with characters or avatars groping one another. So someone would come up and sexually assault someone in the game. And so the creators are in the metaverse. So the creators enacted a perimeter around each avatar so that couldn't happen. So I think part of what's going to happen is that that Meta itself will continue to respond. They tend to respond to public complaints pretty quickly, right? Rather than being forward thinking and saying, hey, here are the issues that we anticipate, let's address them ahead of time. They wait for problems to occur and then address them. So I do think we're going to continue to see self-regulation. And part of that is because I don't think lawmakers fully understand. Now, to your larger point of, will we have separate laws for the metaverse? No, I think the laws that exist outside the metaverse will apply inside the metaverse. And I know some of the professors in the room may have heard of this. There's a famous phrase around internet law that they call the law of the horse. And essentially what this argues is we don't need to recreate laws for virtual spaces. We simply need to apply the existing laws in a way that makes sense in a virtual environment. And so I think that's the approach that they're likely to take. But again, it's going to require problems and issues arising before lawmakers are willing, I think, to act in any substantial way.
Thank you. Do you have? Nós temos mais alguma pergunta aqui, gente, no auditório. Nós temos questionamentos no YouTube. We do have questions on YouTube. So, quer fazer algum questionamento? I will, Professor Josiane will ask you. Pessoal, pode ligar só a nossa câmera, não está nos vendo.
Hello, Professor.
Hello, Professor. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Is it possible to speak of strong democracies around in the world?
So kind of the relationship between social media and democracy?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think there is a promise in social media that allows us to participate in public discourse in a way that we haven't been able to before, and that should strengthen democracy. However, I am concerned that the way social media has been manipulated, I can, again, particularly speak to in our country. So foreign actors, primarily Russians, infiltrated our social media content during the 2016 presidential election and spread misinformation that we believe helped a particular candidate be successful. And so I think when it comes to the democratic promise of social media, I think it offers a lot. It gives each of us a chance to participate in conversations, in forums, in discussions about the issues that matter in our communities. And I tend to think of democracy where the real work happens is often at the local level, right? And so the idea that I can, on social media, be watching a film or be watching a video feed of my city council meeting and pose a question to my representative is incredible, right? The amount of participation it allows for is exciting. However, I think, especially on a national level, there are these issues in terms of, particularly around disinformation, how that can be used to manipulate elections. We also had an issue around political advertising in this country. So ads were being taken out by different groups, either dissuading people, keeping people from voting, or providing the wrong time and dates for election day. And then after the 2020 election saying, well, this election was rigged, the outcome is not valid. And so I am nervous about how this tool can be manipulated. And so I guess to kind of sum up, I think that social media has the potential to have an incredibly positive impact on democracy, provided that we can ensure that it's not manipulated in service of particularly individuals and associations, groups, countries with more power than others.
Professor Carlson, can you see a question in your chat or not? Yes.
I
It
do.
appears.
I do. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a great question. I should read it for folks because I'm not sure everyone can see it. So this is, I think what they're saying, they say one matter that is of special relevance in Brazil, as is in the US, is the possibility of balancing freedom of speech with hate speech. In Brazil, you have a famous precedent in the case of Ellwinger, who was an anti-Semitic who organized books and magazines that denied the Holocaust and defended some Nazi lines of thoughts. In this sense, the US is famous worldwide for defending the right to manifest any idea whatsoever, even if it's offensive to some people or to minority groups. So they're asking about how to deal with this duality of protection in a modern and fake news spread world. Can the US Supreme Court protect both the rights in a given case, or is it mandatory to choose one and deny the other? I think, gosh, if I had a question to this, I'd have millions of dollars. I would have figured it all out. But this is exactly you've honed in on the essential question that balancing free expression and the consequences of hate speech really struggles to answer. And I can only speak to my own kind of personal views on this. I do not think, let me back up. In the United States, we have a tradition of of privileging political speech while being comfortable regulating what we call low value speech. So for example, we freely, and in many other countries, regulate commercial speech. For example, we'll say, you can't say, oh, that this diet pill is going to make you lose weight when it doesn't really do that, something like that. And so I would characterize hate speech as low value speech. I do not think it's essential to protect it. And I think this is, again, me personally, we have identified areas of speech that we say are not warranted First Amendment protection. So obscenity, threats. To me, speech that denies the Holocaust or advocates for harm against a particular ethnic or religious group is not worth protecting. Now, that said, I do not think in the United States there is the political will to actually enact laws against this. I would recommend, if you're interested in this, there's a phenomenal book called The Cult of the Constitution by Marianne. And essentially what she argues in that book is that in some ways, the First Amendment has been manipulated by people in power to maintain their power. And so she's talking specifically about white males. And she looks at kind of this idea that we often will give these justifications for protecting hate speech, like, you know, I may not agree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. And the question becomes, to what end, right? What is that speech, that expression contributing to political discourse? What is it contributing to our democracy? And I would argue nothing. In fact, it's making it more difficult for all kinds of people to participate in our democracy. And so I personally would be in favor of saying, when we engage in that balancing act, which is what all of us are doing, right? Whether it's us, whether it's Germany, whether it's Brazil, we're all engaging in this balancing act between protecting free expression and then dealing with the harmful side effects or outcome that result from that decision. And me personally, when I do that balancing, I'm gonna put expression a little bit lower. I'm gonna say things like our right to privacy, things like our right to human dignity. I'm gonna place that value above expression. Again, I recognize that the ultimate concern is that it will negatively impact press freedom, or that political dissent will be stifled. And that is a very real concern. But I think when it comes to hate speech, we are sophisticated enough to be able to say there's no value in that kind of speech, and therefore it shouldn't be protected. So the next question on the chat is, considering the direct relationship between hate speech and hate crime, what impression does the professor have of American society about President Biden's demonstrations on gun control? Well, I'm honestly embarrassed to be American when it comes to this question, because we know that the lack of gun control is in large part responsible for the amount of gun violence we have in this country. You know, we have an unwillingness to address even small issues like raising the minimum age from 18 to 21, requiring a background check, eliminating access to automatic weapons. And so, you know, people have been engaging in hate speech or even violent action against one another, particularly members of outgroups, since the dawn of time, right? That part is not necessarily new. I think we are more evolved and that it's happening actually less and less than it has in the past. But when you put guns into the equation, all bets are off. And so I feel strongly that we need greater gun control. One of the things that's interesting that's come up here in the United States, as the previous student, Lucas, I think, was asking about, well, how do you balance expression and hate speech? And traditionally, groups like the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, they have traditionally defended like Nazis or right-wing sympathizers or white supremacists, those kinds of folks. And when we start to see at protests so many people carrying guns, at least the California chapter of the ACLU basically said, we're not going to defend that, because when you add a gun to the expression, is it even really free expression? Is it a free debate of ideas at that point? Or is it a threat? Is it an intimidation? Is it that sort of thing? So I think, one, there's a couple issues. Guns at protests make it something to me other than speech. But more broadly, I think we have a much better chance at addressing issues, particularly around racially motivated violence, if we had greater gun control, right? That people may feel this way, right? And that's an issue that we need to address through education, through different means. But feeling this way and being able to act on it with such dire consequences, to me, is just, it's unacceptable. And it's hard for many of us living in the States to kind of stand by and feel like we don't know what else to do. Legislators will not act to make these changes, and so we continue to have these mass shootings.
Thank you. I have a question. I also have a question. We said about terms and conditions here in Brazil. We think that terms and conditions also are contracts, so we can revise these instruments. And there is a documentary, Terms and Conditions May Apply. I don't know if you already saw.
Yeah, right.
But we here can revise, we here can discuss as any other contract. So we sign up these terms and conditions because we know that there is a lot of law inside that we can search the justice after. So there is a way to revise these terms and conditions in US. And do you believe that social media are able to moderate free of speech?
Yeah, so we do not have the same capability to revise terms and conditions. In fact, there have been cases where people have said simply the length of the terms and conditions and their complexity makes them invalid, and courts have disagreed. Essentially, what the social media company puts out there, you essentially agree or you don't agree. And if you have agreed, then you're moving forward as if that's the case. In terms of the broader question about, do I think that social media companies can regulate expression? I think that with some government oversight, yes, they could do a decent job at this. I think the problem right now is, and again, I don't necessarily fault the companies, right? They are media companies. Media companies' main goal is to make money, right? Many of these companies, if they're traded on the public stock market, have a financial responsibility to their shareholders to generate profits. That's what they're required to do. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to us when they regulate expression in a way that benefits their bottom line, even if it causes harm to democracy, harm to users, any of these other kinds of secondary effects. And so I think with some oversight, so some requirements around transparency, about telling us what's being removed and what's not, about having some, one of the things the Digital Markets Act, which is separate from the Digital Services Act, is going to do is break up some of these companies, right? So we haven't talked a lot about antitrust or kind of the size and scope, but like Facebook has almost 3 billion monthly users. I mean, the size of these companies is incredible. And so I think having any organization with that much power to control that much expression across the world is problematic. And so I think there are ways, whether that's through, again, increased transparency, breaking up some of these companies, having some sort of oversight. I think they could do a much better job, and that we could have these platforms, these digital spaces that allow us to do all the things that we love about them, right? I think it's easy to kind of get down on some of the things that are problematic about social media, but they're also the things that allow us to connect with friends across the world or FaceTime with loved ones or that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of benefit and a lot of, I think, promise in getting this regulation right and getting this tool to work for us instead of to harm us. You know, the last thing I'll say is no other industry of this size and this scope operates with this little oversight, right? At least in the United States, you need a permit to, plant a tree in a new neighborhood, or you need a permit to build a new building or to make an addition on your house, or all of these things that the government regulates. The government regulates our water, our electricity, how minerals are removed from the ground. We have all these regulations. And yet when it comes to technology and social media in particular, the government has been hands off. And I think that's where the change needs to happen, even if it's in small increments.
We saw that the US regulated speech as a culture thing, so there is a big difference between US and Brazil, different from cultures, but the Facebook that we use is the same Facebook. So how can we regulate free speech from a worldwide company since we have this big culture difference between countries? So we here in Brazil can discuss the terms and conditions. We can say whether the judge can invalidate terms and conditions. In US you cannot. There is a way to maybe change for a fully market law or international law. Can you think that maybe we can, recently we have experience with Telegram here in Brazil that did want to comply with Brazil law, and we have to search the judge and everything. So there is a problem of culture and the companies that use worldwide. If you can say what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think that is promising is when individual countries have made new laws, if the market is such that they want to be there, they're willing to comply. So I think right now in India, Facebook is working really hard to comply with emerging law because they want that market so badly. We saw the same thing in Germany with the NetzDG, that Facebook is willing to hire a bunch of content moderators in order to comply because they want access to that market. But I think to your larger point, what we're going to end up with is this patchwork, piecemeal, different laws in different places. And I think there's going to need to be a larger cooperative effort. Otherwise, honestly, Europe is going to decide for the rest of us because they've been first with a lot of these things, right? So I'm thinking about now the GDPR. So when it comes to data privacy, arguably the EU is out front. And so I think what we're seeing is technology companies, in order to comply with EU regulations, because it's access to such a large market, that they're going to mold themselves in a way that fits with those regulations, and the rest of us will probably just end up following suit. I think we may see something similar with the Digital Services Act, that these larger bodies, especially those that are making rules first, are going to determine what the rules are essentially for the rest of us. Now, that said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I know in the United States, because we have such terrible federal digital privacy laws, that the GDPR, the laws in the EU around privacy and data privacy, have positively affected us. For example, like now when I go onto a website, I get asked if I want to accept cookies. That's because of the GDPR. That's not because anything that anybody in the United States did. So I do think these larger bodies are going to end up really working with the platforms to determine what the regulations should look like.
One last question, Professor Carlson, is about the regulator of internet by code. We read the Lawrence Lessig books here, Code, and do you think that that thesis about regulate the internet and everything by code is still alive?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I am confident that we actually are likely to evolve from that, and that it's going to look more like legislation and regulation that emerges to address certain particular concerns, especially associated with human rights. So the human right to free expression or the human right to privacy. I think there's going to be a shift, and that regulation is going to look a lot more responsive than Lessig predicts.
Okay, we have another question from Martina De Biasi. Wait a minute.
Yeah, hi Martina.
She will paste the question in your
okay,
chat.
Great.
Tá no YouTube ali, no YouTube. Just a minute.
No worries. Thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions. I so enjoy discussing this, and I think this process that we're even engaged in right now about what are the creative solutions, because as I said earlier, social media is only, what, 16 years old?
Yes.
It can barely drive a car. And so it's unsurprising that we haven't figured out how to, like we talked about earlier, kind of enable the democratic functions, the ability to connect with others, the things out of it that are so good, and really address the problems in a way so that it works for individuals and societies. I think that's incredibly doable. I just think it's going to take time. Okay, Martina says, what do you think is the best solution on hate crimes in the modern world, especially in social media? These crimes aren't quite easy to take the name of the people who does them. What kind of laws does social media and even countries can make to make them less common? Gosh, I think, you know, the increased penalties on hate crimes, I think hopefully do dissuade people. But I do think there's this larger issue here of like, when we talk about how do we regulate something, and I'm a legal communication scholar, I always am thinking about how can policy address a particular issue. But I think when it comes to hate speech and hate crimes, part of what we need to get to is, where does that come from? Why is it that one member of one group is so willing to attack a member of another group? And is there a way, and I honestly think, and this might sound cheesy, but I do think education is where the answer lies, right? Particularly when we're thinking about educating young people, elementary school, middle school. How do we get students to understand concepts like human dignity or like human equality? I don't know if you've been watching here in the United States, but there's an effort by conservatives to say, don't talk about race in school. Don't talk about being gay in school. And I think that's really problematic. I think the further along we can get in terms of respecting human dignity, to understanding one another's cultures and languages and ways of life, the less likely we are to see this hatred between groups. And so, again, while I think there are some legislative solutions to kind of put, that feels some ways like putting a Band-Aid on a broken arm, when instead we need to address the broken arm. And I think we do that through public education.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to really thank you for having this lecture with us. We have students here hanging your book, so I would like to someday maybe you can come to Brazil and sign these books.
It would be my absolute pleasure, and I promise I'll work on my Portuguese before I come, so that I can understand a little bit better. Absolutely.
I was talking with Professor Josiane, and we are very impressed with your research on this matter. So we really did a great job with your book and everything. So thank you very much, Professor Carlson. It was a great pleasure to have you here with our students. And I think that this is just the beginning of our partnership, and
Agreed.
we'd like to say, to see you here in Brazil.
Agreed. And I would just extend to, especially the professors in the room, I'm fascinated with how this is playing out there. So if anybody is interested, or even students in co-authoring or working together, I'm always looking to collaborate. And as you said, I think this is just the beginning of a great partnership. So thank you so much for including me and inviting me and giving me this time to talk with you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night. Thank you very much.
Bye, Director Tums. Thank you again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bom, acho que já pode finalizar, Laura, lá na transmissão aqui. E aí, gente?
Show de bola, hein?